Isaac Hedges. In our top stories tonight, we'll be looking at turning green, a fragile truce, and bot recovery. All that and much more coming your way on GWP News Weekly. Well, folks, if you tuned in last week, may have noticed we are trying something a little bit different. Again, if this is your first time in a while, may not realize exactly what's going on, but again, that is quite all right. So, of course, we do GWP News Weekly, certainly as the name implies here, weekly on Mondays. So some great information you have going into your week and something you do not want to miss. And well, we're trying something a bit new here. Our longtime viewers will notice that I'm not joined in the studio here by co-host Jacob Fulmer, but not to fret. You won't be stuck with yours truly here for much longer, because we will see Jake momentarily in the weather and sports segments that will be here before long. Hopefully we'll be able to survive until then. So in the meantime, we've seen some recent developments on a story actually that we covered a bit in the past week, the situation with Greenland. And well, some of the folks at home may be turning green just because they've gotten so sick of hearing about it, but nonetheless, we have seen recent developments on the situation regarding Greenland. So, of course, we know for some time that our President Trump, has expressed some interest in acquiring Greenland from a national security standpoint, sort of having that territory, though we have seen objection from Greenland themselves, from Denmark, which now owns Greenland, and a number of other European countries and NATO allies. And that sort of relates to the most recent development on this situation. Well, some of those NATO allies that had spoken against the United States sort of moving in and taking over Greenland, as it were, well, they're actually sending some troops to Greenland to see what they can do in theory. But again, that raises a certain question. Again, if we're do believe that those are sort of the motives, again, unclear what other reason these countries, these different NATO allies, would have for sending their troops into Greenland. Well, from a practical standpoint, if it were to come to this, depending on how things would shake out, well, how exactly would it look? Again, what are their chances? So if we look into this a bit deeper, again, Greenland, with the defense of these different NATO allies that have sent in troops, well, we see that the United States still maintains a competitive advantage. They're in Greenland despite NATO allies sending troops. And the key reason for that is that American forces already have extensive basing rights there, of course, according to the 1951 Defense of Greenland Agreement, plus the Patuxent Space Base, formerly known as the Thule Air Base there in Greenland, which gives Washington unmatched strategic reach in the Arctic. NATO allies have increased their presence to deter escalation in the region, but their deployments are limited at this point to exercises of symbolic shows of solidarity rather than permanent counterbalance to the United States power, as it were. So again, at this point, sort of just showing support, symbolic support here, as it were, solidarity with Greenland. Now, from a practical standpoint, again, how exactly their troops would hold up against the United States, that is another story. Again, the United States already has a considerable competitive advantage in that, with our military, again, being a top world power, as many would say, the global hegemon. Well, again, that gives us a considerable advantage on that front. And in the past, we've certainly been on friendly terms with Greenland. We already have a space base there. We have a United States presence there, and have some degree of freedom to work in Greenland already. So again, there are those that say in practice, well, we already have all of this freedom to operate in Greenland. Do about anything else? Why exactly would we do this? And well, it is fair enough to say that, but then again, it certainly is different from right out owning Greenland. So certainly there is a great deal of debate on that front as to what exactly it would do for our national security interest. But again, generally speaking, having a territory across these different areas can be beneficial for national defense. Of course, this past week, if you missed it, we did cover the situation going on in Greenland in our segment, Another Dog Sled. We talked about some of the defense, of course, in a comment at that time recently that President Trump had made that Greenland perhaps had added another dog sled in terms of their national defense. Well, again, one would be forgiven for assuming that he was joking there, that he was joking and not being serious, but on the contrary, the uh, country Greenland actually has a national defense that relies somewhat majorly on dog sleds team. Again, interestingly, he was being serious. Our dog sled teams, their troops there are actually called the Sirius, Sirius, dog sled teams. And again, to recent estimates, their national defense consists mainly of 15 to 16 dog sleds with about 11 or 12 dogs per sled, a two-man crew. So again, certainly the weather plays a role in that. Naturally, sort of Arctic region, much different sort of climate, sort of weather than what we're used to in that area. But that said, again, the United States being the world power that it is, would seem to have a comparable advantage in that conflict were it to escalate to that, which again seems somewhat unlikely. There's certainly talk of it. Certain people seem to be afraid that it's going to escalate to that degree sometime soon. But from a practical standpoint, there seem to be a lot of other things going on. Again, um, a lot of irons in the fire, a lot of different things going on. This does not seem to be sort of the top interest from the United States, certainly in terms of American interests at this point. So it still seems unlikely that we'll see a great deal of solid development on that front. But again, certainly worth noting, and that about covers the recent developments on the situation in Greenland. Now, moving on to other international affairs. Well, we've seen recent development on the situation in the Middle East, which, of course, you've been following us for a decent amount of time here on GWP News. We covered recently. We said, oh, it looks like things have largely smoothed out. It isn't a major thing at this point. But that said, there was some concern even at the time as to whether that agreement would hold, as to whether things sort of would crop back up and get ugly again. There certainly was that concern, that possibility. Sort of had a cautious optimism about that. And well, things it seemed were smoothed over for some time, but it only lasted so long. Unclear exactly what happened. Some conflict still between Israel and Hamas. But we've heard in just recent times, apparently, that they have reached a new agreement, a new ceasefire, a truce of sorts, as it were, on that front. And again, a major part of that, this recent agreement between Israel and Hamas, is the return by Hamas of approximately 20 living hostages. And we've seen this in recent times. Some of the past agreements that have been made, some of the past agreements that were in talk, it was always a big part of these agreements, it seems, was the return of hostages. Again, a different Israeli citizens that Hamas took hostage largely is what we're referring to here. Though, again, those numbers sort of were discussed in terms of specifics. We didn't know a great deal about it beforehand, but again, many of those hostages, of course, as per those agreements, were sent back. But the unfortunate thing here is that not all of those hostages were sent back alive. Again, as we know, the conditions there, certainly the hostages held in confinement, held in prisons, and that's not a prison in the modern sense as we have here in the United States. Again, much less hospitable. Again, many of them, we saw the video footage of some of them returning home after past hostage releases in the conflict. Well, they looked fairly unhealthy. Some of them appeared to be somewhat on the brink of starvation. And again, very sad, some of the conditions that they had these people in. And sadly, some of the hostages were not returned alive, returned simply the remains of the hostages, and that is not something that was noted previously. That's something they got back to their country, got back to their families, and found that their relatives who had been taken hostage were since deceased. Again, so very unfortunate, just horrible for those families. Now, certainly here it is noted that the agreement is to the return of approximately 20 living hostages. But again, as has been the case in the past, if that can be any indication of what's to come here, there hasn't always been complete transparency about that. Again, both parties haven't always followed the agreement to a T. So, again, prayers for the hostages returning home in that area. Again, that they are, at the very least, alive, returned in one piece, which is, as we mentioned, more than can be said of past hostage releases that were agreed to. So, certainly important recent development there in the Middle East, and naturally, as it is a developing story, there's a lot of question up in the air about what exactly will happen on that front. So we will continue to follow that story. I'll have to stay tuned here, GWP News, for all the developing details on that situation. But again, that is the extent of the available information, the most recent developments on the situation in the Middle East at that point. Now, moving on a bit onto the lighter side, that is, onto a more local story. Well, locals will know that we recently had a tornado rip through our city and cause considerable damage. And I have to pardon the interruption, folks. Apologies for that. Now, of course, in the past year, in 2025, we had a tornado rip through the city of Nevada here, and it caused considerable damage, certainly to the Oaks Inn, largely destroyed different homes and businesses, took considerable damages. As we've talked about extensively here on GWP News, we've even talked about in the past on the Great World podcast. Now, what we've often mentioned in those discussions, however, is that while our own city of Nevada here, took a decent amount of damage, well, perhaps a neighboring town, Mountainville, Missouri, took more damage. Again, that little town didn't have a whole lot to begin with, was largely leveled after the tornado. So very unfortunate there. Many homes and businesses took more severe damage, tends to be the case, as we've seen up to this point. And Again, not a huge town. There aren't exactly a whole lot of businesses in the area. There are a few, and at least in the area, the few that are there are somewhat well known. Now, a few years ago, there were several different gas stations, convenience stores in the area there in Moundville. But in terms of much more recent times, and for a little while now, had just one gas station, one full service gas station at that. And again, that has been the extent of it. But that being the bought service station, again, just one of the many things destroyed that took damage there in our area. This tornado the past year in 2025. And again, we introduced that at the top of the show, bot recovery. Well, one would be forgiven for assuming that we were referring to, as we talk about often on GWP news here and even on the Great World podcast, we were actually talking about artificial intelligence, robotics, extension of that. Well, no, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the bot service station, BOTT service station in Moundville, Missouri, which again was destroyed after this tornado in the past year, tragically. Again, it was a huge loss to the town. It was their last gas station, but in recent times, they've actually managed to rebuild. So, very fortunate for the city there. We've seen some recent coverage, notably from an interview with the second generation owner of Bot Service Station, Craig Bott, an interview with him in the Nevada Daily Mail. Well, again, part of this rebuilding effort was supported by naturally just their insurance claim on the damages. Again, that helped out a bit, but what largely this was helped out by was assisted by was just different people in the community making donations, helping support, helping rebuild, different things like that. So again, clearly was a community effort coming together and seeing that they could rebuild a bought service station there. They even set up a GoFundMe page for the store, and fortunately, they will be opening soon. It appears that the new building has been built, and while the original one was pretty well destroyed, there were a few historical items from the original store that they managed to salvage. Again, one of those, albeit being a bit dented up, though it appears certainly, as per his interview with the Nevada Daily Mail, that it still works. But again, a very old refrigerator from the store, one of the things managed to salvage. Another thing, a sort of a decorative mannequin that they had in the store, that was salvaged somehow. It survived the tornado. And one other thing, perhaps the most notable historical aspect of that, and sort of a relic of the old city of Moundville from back in its heyday, is the old large clock from the Moundville train depot, which was featured in their store, and it did fall and hit the ground during the tornado. Again, some glass was broken, it was beaten up, it was bent a bit, but it appears that they were able to repair it. Again, that's one thing noted here. A lot of that was done themselves. Again, the president owner of the station appears to have been able to, fortunately, make a great deal of those repairs themselves, but it appears they're getting that historical clock back to operational will be featured in their new store. So certainly many people in the area may be familiar with bought service stations. Certainly older people around the area could be familiar with it. Certainly have relatives or live in Moundville yourself. Again, very fortunate to have that back. And it appears that they will be open again before long. So it'll be a great opportunity, whether you're a long-time customer of the store or hearing about it now for the first time, be a great opportunity to check it out. And surely, after all that has been thrown their way, after all the hardship from the tornado, surely they would appreciate business. Yes, apologies again for the interruption on that front. Folks, thank you for your patience on that front. And of course, another interesting thing, certainly, as we mentioned, one of the elements of that sort of attesting to Moundville being not all that it once was. Again, something of a ghost town, at least compared to its past self, but that wasn't always the case. Again, used to have a train depot right there. They have the clock from it in Bott Service Station. Will be featured in their new store, which will be open here before long. And another interesting note on that, again mentioned in this interview with the owner, Craig Bott. Well, again, he is the second generation owner of the store there, Bott Service Station, and grew up around it naturally, around his father with the store and all. And so, one experience that he recounted from his childhood was this fellow, this older boy coming into the store who was hunting coons a couple summers that he came in. And again, later in life, the present owner, second generation owner, Craig Bott, asked his father, that is, who exactly that fellow was. And he told him who that was. Well, that was none other than Hank Williams Jr. Again, famous in his own right as a musician, his father being Hank Williams Sr., and also a very famous musician on that front. So, again, certainly from a modern view, it may be difficult to imagine such a small town, a ghost town, being visited by such a famous person, but very interesting thing there. Visited Bott Service Station. And while the original store that Hank Williams Jr. visited back in the day is no longer there, unfortunately, a couple of things from the original store, as we mentioned, are still there. Certainly that historical clock from the old Moundville train depot we mentioned, and the historical refrigerator. Again, a bit newer than the clock itself, but historical nonetheless. So again, some very consequential recent developments on that front. And as always, if there are any stories that you would like to contribute for GWP News Weekly or any of our other offerings here at Great World Productions, if you'd like to make a contribution, you can always put a comment in the video down below. You can also give us a call at our offices, 417-448-0819. Again, let us know if there's something you think we ought to cover. If you've got any questions, again, just leave a detailed message with your name, and we'll get back to you on that if we happen to miss your call, of course. But certainly, great opportunity there. Would not want to miss out on it. That about covers recent things in current events. So up next is weather with Jacob Coleman.
So now we'll go ahead and we'll move into weather here on this week's weekly news here. We're going to start by looking at the winter storm that moved through our region across the weekend. It's still moving through across the Northeast, bringing in some snow as well as a little bit of ice. The majority of this is snow here, but you'll notice that that moisture is certainly still there. The heaviest snowfall rates have come to an end, but we are still picking up a little bit of some moderate snow here across eastern Massachusetts, and we're going to continue to see that through the rest of today. And then tomorrow we'll have just a little bit of lake effect snow. Not a whole lot is anticipated out of the storm system, with the worst of the impacts coming through. That, of course, was the National Weather Service radar, where we're getting that from. And then we also are now going to look at tropical tidbits here, tropicaltidbits.com, where you can find all the latest runs when it comes to the different computer models here. We're going to be looking at the GFS models 12Z run from January 26th to show you that snowfall that is anticipated through the rest of this evening. Here's about midnight, lighter snow showers lingering across some of the areas here. And then as you go into tomorrow, there's that quick burst of lake effect snow that is expected during the afternoon and evening hours. And then on Wednesday morning, a little bit of lake effect snow lingering, but the majority of that will start to move out of here. But a couple more days of some light snow is going to be continuing as the rest of the storm system begins to work its way out of the Northeast. Here across Missouri, it has moved out. Of course, these are the unofficial totals that we showed you yesterday, with Nevada picking up about 6.5 inches, Columbia just over 5. And so again, no forecast is, or no snow is currently forecasted. There is some low chances that we'll be looking at here in just a moment, but that will give us a little bit of a time to dig out from this last winter storm that we just saw here. And so we'll go ahead and we'll update those weather alerts. These are the national weather alerts from the National Weather Service. And you'll notice that we still have extreme cold warnings in effect for tomorrow, going through Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi. Then we've got those cold weather advisories across this very light blue that extends from New York all the way down into Florida, even Florida under those cold weather advisories, also in Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma, where we're expecting one more chilly night of temperatures. Even a sliver of, or just a small portion, I guess you could say, of southeastern Missouri is under those extreme cold warnings. At least for our area across Missouri, no winter weather alerts in effect. So the most dangerous cold has moved out. That being said, it is still going to be chilly over the next several days, just not as dangerous as what we've seen the last several 3 to 4 days or so. As we look at those power outages, this is from poweroutage.com. We've got 765,000 customers still without power across the country, but the majority of those being states that were impacted by the ice portion of the storm system. Of course, we've got Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee still in that 100,000 plus range, as you can see here on this legend here. Again, you can find that at poweroutage.com is where you can find these graphics here. But again, 3 states in that 100,000 plus range, including Tennessee, which is at the top of our list at nearly 250,000 our million customers without power. And so that's about a third of our power outages is just in the state of Tennessee alone. Then we've got Mississippi at 159,000, Louisiana at 119,000 in that top three. And that's where we had the worst of the ice, with some areas picking up about an inch of ice. And so that's what led to these power outages. We still have one state in that 50,000 to 100,000 range, and that's in the yellow here, and that's Texas at 57,000 outages. And then we have several states anywhere from 10 to 50,000, including Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Colorado. The top of that list, of course, we've got Kentucky at 41,000, South Carolina at 35,000, North Carolina and Virginia with just a little bit less, but still with quite a few customers without power. As far as percentages go, we have Mississippi still has the most by percentage. We've got just about under 11,000 of the state is without power. Tennessee is at about 7,000 right now, and you can see some other states at less than 2% overall when it comes to the percentage of power outages. We did have a few people here across the state of Missouri lose power earlier this morning. That was all part of these rolling blackouts. So those were intentionally done to conserve energy so that not everybody would lose power. The idea behind it is that you'll only lose power for about 30 minutes to an hour, and then it will come back on so that it's not enough time to where you're going to have major issues when it comes to getting too cold or going too long without heat. And so that's kind of the whole idea behind those rolling blackouts. That should have been the last evening of those taking place, but a few cannot be ruled out. Then we're looking here at MoDot, traveler.modot.org/map/, and that's showing us our current road conditions, things beginning to clear up across Vernon County. We're currently in that mostly clear range. We've still got some mostly covered roads across Barton and into Jasper County as well, going into Lawrence and Greene County, spreading over into Springfield, where we had some of the heavier snow accumulations. Some areas picking up 8 to 9 inches across this area. That's why we have fully covered roads at this point in time across places like Christian County and into Douglas County as well. Even a few roads are still cleared. The Kansas City metro area overall is mostly clear, with a couple of areas in northern Kansas City metro still in that covered range. As far as here in Boone County across Columbia, those highways that we talked about yesterday, those county roads, are still closed, and we do still have mostly covered across most of the roadways in Boone County. So still clearing out from that snow. So just travel safely if you are going to be out on the roads, because they are certainly still slick, as well as the sidewalks if you're going to be walking those as well. So again, the snow is going to stick around for quite some time, as we are expecting that colder air to linger as the ongoing impacts from the storm continue to stay with us. And you'll notice as we go through the rest of this week, staying well below average. In fact, we may even stay below freezing the entire week across the state of Missouri. So of course, the sun is going to melt some of the snow. If we get a southerly wind, that can also melt the snow. Even some fog, that could melt some of the snow. And of course, the sun will melt the snow, as we mentioned, but not a whole lot of melting as far as from the temperatures, because temperatures expected to stay on that below average side here. And you'll notice the next several days, again, that storm system moving out. But as we look back here at the GFS model, not a whole lot in the forecast. So things certainly drying out for the most part through the rest of this week. Again, there will be a slight chance for a snow shower or two. Not expecting a whole lot in the way of accumulations at this point in time. Maybe a quick dusting or random snow showers we go into Thursday and Friday, but overall that's going to be kind of on the light side, very low chance of any of that happening. And then maybe another chance as we go into this weekend. We'll have to watch this, a possible weekend storm system setting up for this coming weekend on the eastern half of the country. Too early to know any of the details as far as that goes. Then as we look at the long range temperature outlook going into the month of February, we will see a brief warm up into the early part of February, but there will still be some bouts of colder air that we're going to have to continue to deal with into the first 7 to 10 days of the month of February. And that lines up with the Climate Prediction Center's 6 to 10 day outlook. We've still got temperatures are expected to stay below average from January 31st to February 4th, across the eastern portion here of the country, with the western half of the country likely staying above average. Precipitation overall is going to be staying on the below average side. So not a whole lot of winter weather chances expected moving forward. And then as we look at that 8 to 14 day outlook, also presented here by the Climate Prediction Center, February 2nd through the 8th, expecting below average temperatures, but temperatures returning to near average across the state of Missouri in the early part of the month. But occasional cold shots of air will move in, so we'll have to watch that. Then as we go even further out into the middle of the month, February 7th through the 20th, the Climate Prediction Center is saying that either we're going to stay right around average, maybe leaning slightly below average. So that's something to keep in mind as we go into the month of February. As far as that month temperature outlook, staying around average overall across the state of Missouri, at least for now, with some of that colder air locking further to the north later into the month of February. So as far as will there be any relief from the colder temperatures in the month of February, it looks like there certainly will, but there still is going to be a couple of cold days mixed in there, is what the forecast is showing. On that hazardous outlook here, we look at the hazards outlook every single week here on GWP News Weekly, and you'll notice that we do have that moderate risk for hazardously cold temperatures across the southeast and eastern part of the country, and even a slight risk here across Missouri as well as into the northeast, going all the way into February 8th. So we could still be looking at some dangerously cold temperatures, not nearly as dangerous, more on the side of just very uncomfortable, less dangerous, but certainly something that we will have to continue to watch as we go into the first week of February. And there are no other areas that are highlighted on the hazardous outlook from the Climate Prediction Center. All right, well, that will wrap up things on weather. Now we move into sports. Now we'll go ahead and go into the sports portion of this weekly news update. We're going to go ahead and start off by talking about the AFC and NFC championship games, of course, with the winners being the New England Patriots and the Seattle Seahawks. So the AFC side, the Patriots did end up winning, and then Seattle won last night against the Rams. So the Rams and the Broncos fall just a little bit short of the Super Bowl, and so that sets up a rematch of Super Bowl 49 between the Seattle Seahawks and the Patriots. So with that in mind, we're going to look at the history between these two different teams going into the Super Bowl. Before we do that, just kind of an interesting fact about this Super Bowl. Both teams in the regular season lost their first game. That has never happened before. Only 8 Super Bowl winners lost their first game in the regular season, but there has never been a Super Bowl matchup in which both teams lost the first game in the regular season. So just something interesting and historic. It's taken 60 Super Bowls for us to see something like that happen. So quite interesting. Both of these teams losing their first seasonal game, but being able to recover and making it all the way to the Super Bowl with each of them having the same record. And so that is quite an interesting fact, at least that I thought when it came to this coming Super Bowl that we have. Something else to keep in mind is that the Seattle Seahawks have won 11 times in all 20 games that they've ever played. There's never been a tie between these two teams, and they played most recently on September 15th, 2024, where the game actually went into overtime, and Seattle did end up winning the last matchup between these two teams. Of course, that was in 2024, so that was the last football season. So, that doesn't really say a whole lot about this season. We haven't seen them play this season, so it ought to be a very interesting matchup. But something else that's interesting is the last several games have came down to the very last minute when you look back at the history. So of course I mentioned that they played back in 2024. They also played on September 20th, 2020. Seattle won that game 35-30. That was in Seattle. Then we had the Seahawks won against New England back in 2016. In fact, the last time that the New England Patriots have beat the Seattle Seahawks was in Super Bowl 49 on February 1st of 2015. The Patriots won that game 28-24. That was back when Tom Brady was playing for the Patriots. Before that, there were several other matchups, including a very close Seattle win 24-23 back in 2012. We can trace this back all the way to 1977 when New England Patriots beat them in their first matchup 31-0. But again, overall, Seattle has the advantage, winning 11 versus 9 games that they've lost. So that's kind of interesting that the Seattle Seahawks lead that series overall 11-9. But even though the Seattle Seahawks lead the series, the Patriots have scored more points overall, with New England Patriots scoring 423 points and Seattle scoring 408 points in those matchups. So it's quite interesting that even though these two teams are from different conferences, there is quite a bit of history, and also they're making history with them being the first teams to have ever made it to the Super Bowl, both of them at least, that being that lost their first game in the season. So that's quite interesting. So again, that Super Bowl matchup is going to be on Sunday, February 8th, here in a couple of weeks at 5:30 Central, 6:30 Eastern, and that can be found on NBC and Peacock. The game is going to be at the home field of the San Francisco 49ers. So that's where the Super Bowl is going to be, and that is some of the statistics looking into that history between the two teams. So, with that, we now go into some other sports news. Of course, we have the college basketball rankings that were recently released. Arizona is still looking to be the team to beat at this point, as they are 20-0 at the number one spot on the men's basketball side. Again, they've won every single game. And so then, of course, we have UConn at number two. They've won the last 15 games in a row. They're 19-1. Michigan at number three, 18-1 is their record. Purdue, Duke, Houston, Nebraska, Gonzaga, Iowa State, and Michigan State round out the last of the top 10, with Nebraska also being undefeated at this point in time with a little bit of an easier schedule, 20 games in a row. Nebraska sitting at number seven. Duke has also only had one loss and has won the last 7 games here. We've got other teams like Vanderbilt that are bouncing back after a couple losses in a row after their 17-0 start. So that is the Associated Press's top 25 men's basketball rankings. We can also look at the women's side of things, where UConn remains undefeated at this point in time, 21-0 on a 21-game win streak, which of course that's pretty interesting considering that the men's side is also 19-1. So collectively, UConn has only lost one game between the men's and the women's basketball teams, looking very strong on both sides. UCLA on the women's side is number 3 on a 13-game win streak at a 19-1 record. So Texas is 19-2 after suffering a recent loss, still undefeated at home at the number 4 spot. Vanderbilt, of course, has had quite success with a little bit of some issues the last couple of weeks, or a couple of losses for Vanderbilt on the men's side, but overall on the women's side, still 20-1, although they did suffer their first loss of the season most recently. LSU, Michigan, Louisville, TCU, and Iowa are also in the top 10 on the Associated Press's rankings here. Notably, Louisville has a 12-game win streak at 19-3, sitting at that number 8 spot. And then Kentucky has slid down quite a bit on the rankings. They're now number 11 as they're at 17-5 after they've now lost 3 games in a row. Maryland, who was 17-2, is now 17-4 after losing their last couple of games. They're sitting at number 15. We've also got Oklahoma, Tennessee, Ole Miss, Texas Tech, and Princeton. Princeton at 17-1 as well, with undefeated at home at number 20. And then, of course, we could follow this all the way down to the end of the list, with Washington rounding out the list in the women's side of things at number 25. 15-4 is their record. So, something that is certainly quite interesting on those rankings. And of course, we've still got just a little bit over a month left of the regular season. Of course, late in February, that's when we'll start looking at some of those championship matchups, or we'll start also talking about the possibility of who's going to make the March Madness. A little bit too early to make those predictions yet, so we'll have to wait just a few more weeks before we can start doing that. Something else that's only a couple weeks away is the 2026 Winter Olympics. Of course, we mentioned that the Super Bowl will be covered by NBC and Peacock. The same can be said for the Winter Olympics this season as they go to Milan here. But on January 26th, which of course was today, NBC's Today released an article stating the list of the roster for those Olympics. Again, the Olympics are expected to begin on February 4th. And so now we know all of the team members that are going to be there. There's going to be 232 athletes that are going to be coming back. And something that's quite interesting is that we will have 10 athletes that will be competing for a 4th time. 22 are coming back for a 3rd time, and 33 Olympic medalists are and 13 returning Olympic medalists and 18 Olympians who won a combined 22 gold medals. And so that, of course, was from the NBC Today article. And so quite interesting that we have that. We also have some notable returns, including athletes like Chloe Kim and Lindsey Vonn. So that is going to be, those are a couple people from that roster of 232 athlete roster from the Milan Games, and 98 of the Olympians are going to be returning from previous Winter Olympics as well. And so this actually makes it the biggest returning number, like as far as the most returning Olympians that we've ever had here on the USA team. So, of course, the Olympics coming up in just a couple of weeks. We will provide a little bit of coverage here on GWP once that takes place, including a special Winter Olympics episode that we will be releasing next week, late next week, when the opening ceremony takes place. That's going to be under the Great World Podcast Season 5. We'll have an episode for that. So that wraps up our sports coverage. Now we'll go ahead and we'll finish off this weekly news update by looking at the GWP Weekly Surprise. The weekly surprise was that there was a recent research that took place that tested AI against 100,000 humans on creativity. And what was found was pretty shocking. This is why it's the weekly surprise. AI can now beat the average human creativity. This took place back on January 25th at the University of Montreal. And so basically, what happened is that the majority of people in the survey were beat on creativity by artificial intelligence. That information came from ScienceDaily.com, which released that. Well, that wraps up things for tonight on this GWP weekly news, or News Weekly. Well, that wraps up things for tonight here on GWP News Weekly. We'll see you next week. Stay warm.